hello, and then I'll turn it back on at the end today. We're glad to have you here in our fruit tree pruning class. I've now presented this type of class for probably since 2017 and had a lot of folks go through it. And while it does seem kind of strange to deliver it as a webinar and digital, it is one that I think sometimes works really well. And we know as we present this presentation that a lot of folks are planning to prune their fruit trees the upcoming month, and hopefully kind of before into the next growing season starts. My name is Grant McCarty. I am a local foods and small farms educator, and I cover Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. Primarily, I work with commercial and non-commercial growers that sell at farmers markets, pick your own operations, and other places. The way that I designed this program is to help those that maybe have some very old neglected trees that have gotten no attention whatsoever, as well as those that maybe have just planted their trees in this last season in 2020, and potentially those that maybe are in the middle pack. So maybe it's your fruit trees are 3 to 5 years in age. Primarily what we'll talk about today is going to be apples and pears will be one group, and then we'll talk about the stone fruit in another grouping of them, is what we'll plan to do with it as we go along today. You should have gotten handouts in an email this morning. If not, we'll make sure that you have those sent back to you at the end of today's class as well. So what we're really going to do is talk a lot about getting started. Kind of what are some of the basics when it comes to pruning fruit trees and thinking about how you need to prune your fruit trees potentially more effective. What are some of those basic questions that we get at the University of Illinois Extension Office every year when it comes to fruit tree pruning? We'll get into some of the general cuts you want to consider and some of the cuts that you really need to make when it comes to getting your trees potentially back in shape. And then I have a number of examples to show you using some of the fruit trees that are at my family's farm in Tennessee, which is a photo you see here, a really ugly, neglected, rough looking fruit tree, but one that we really like the variety that produces. So you'll see some of my ugly fruit trees, as well as some of the fruit trees I just planted this past 2020. A number of you have also sent fruit tree photos to me, and so I've tried to incorporate some of them in today's presentation. If you still want to send me fruit tree photos after today, you're more than welcome to do that. And for those that have sent me photos already, I will try to get those back to you in a timely fashion. So we'll go through examples. We'll get into kind of those like next cuts. So say you get really comfortable pruning this season, what might the next cuts be? Or what are some things that you might need to consider when it comes to, the overall health of your tree kind of going forward for the years to come? When we think about fruit tree pruning, we need to recognize that it's very important to know that tree. If I'm dealing with a standard tree that has matured to 25, 30 feet tall, that's going to be pruned a little bit different than if we have a dwarf tree or a semi-dwarf tree, one of those smaller trees that maybe is reaching maturity at 14 to 15 feet. When we get into some of the principles of how much you can prune in a given season, you will find that for a standard tree, you may be able to remove a lot of limbs and a lot of wood. And yet when we compare that to a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree, we're really not able to prune as much. And you may have to actually stagger your pruning out for the years to come, which we'll talk about today of what that means. I think it's also important to think about the actual end shape that we're thinking of. A lot of the fruit trees that we grow in Northern Illinois are really designed to grow in a certain shape to get the most out of it. So for instance, apples and pears, when we talk about this, they have a central leader style. And the central leader style is very similar to, say, a Christmas tree. You think about how it has one central trunk, and off of that main trunk, you have those branches. When we think of that in terms of the apples and pears, you have hopefully one central trunk, and then off of those branches of that central leader of an apple or pear would be where your fruit is going to develop. The Espalier design, it was apples and pears, kind of what you see in this photo. I'll go a little bit into that because we've had some folks ask about, how might I get this Espalier design? It is a design very similar to you might think of with a grapevine, perhaps, think of how grapevine shapes are. For compass, Open fruit, bowl, vase, all of those terms tend to mean the same. And this is a group of peaches, cherries, plums, nectarines. All of those are stone fruits that do much better kind of in that different shape. They could be in the central leader, and you may find that their tree has gotten to an age where you can't get it into this kind of open fruit bowl shape. And so you're just going to stay on the central leader. But factor that in. You may find that in your backyard, you have some trees that will be an open fruit bowl shape, like a peach or a plum. And then you also have apples and pears, which might be an entirely different design. Some of the basic questions that we get at the extension office are very general. One of the questions every year is, when to prune. Typically, for fruit tree pruning, we recommend mid-December to about March 1st. You could push this a little bit into March, and yet the reason for this time period is that if you are doing any extensive pruning, say removing a big limb or doing a lot more aggressive pruning of different limbs, they need some time to seal up properly. And so you may find that if you, say, try to prune at the end of March, or heaven forbid you try to prune into April, there's not enough time for the tree to concentrate on sealing up those wounds to then move to its next growth stage. It can be very complicated and very hard for it to do. So that's why we recommend, kind of have that March 1st as kind of the stopping point. Maybe you could go into mid-March depending on the season, but be very cautious of it. Ideally, you're also pruning about 30 to 40% per season. So think of it about 1/3 of the limbs on a tree that you're thinking of pruning will come out that season. For a standard tree, 25, 30 feet, that could be quite a lot that could potentially be removed. You compare that to a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree, you may not be talking about a lot that needs to come out. And I'll show you some photos today of, thinking that, okay, you may have to stagger it out where a tree has 3 or 4 big limbs, and yet one limb comes out in 2021, another one comes out in 2022, another one in 2023, because it would be taking too much from that tree. Another question, do I seal the cuts up? I see this product all the time. You see here this pruning seal, and yet we don't recommend it, especially for fruit trees. The reason for that is that the tree, if you prune it at the right time of the year, will naturally seal up those wounds that have been made when you've made a cut. And we also find that this sealant can lock in moisture and potentially kill your fruit tree. So we don't recommend that. Some guides will mention dormant oil or dormant spray. And this is a spray that can be applied to address very small insects like aphids, scales, and others. And it is one that, while it has that term dormant oil, it does need to be applied when the temperatures are in the 30s and the 40s. So realistically, you would not be applying this at the same time that you're actually pruning your fruit trees. Let's say that you have kind of postponed your pruning plans and it now is like the last week of February. And you don't feel like you can do much pruning. Try to go after some of those water sprouts or those suckers, very small, kind of pencil width in diameter, are ones that could easily be pruned out with some very nice hand pruners. And of course, we know that as soon as you start pruning those, it seems like you magically get a lot more of them than you were expecting. And yet that's just how it is. We'll talk a little more about that though, as we go along today. One other thing we know is that sometimes we have a very tall standard fruit tree and all the fruit is at the top. And you might think to yourself, well, could I just kind of come through and clear cut it? And we really don't recommend this. The reason for that is, when you're doing this pruning action, the growth hormones are going to send to where that pruning has been done. And so what you're going to encounter is that you already had a problem with so much of the growth higher up in that fruit tree, and the topping is going to continue that problem. So it's not going to actually really address the problem you're encountering, and it can actually result in much more aggressive growth up high. And you see that in both of these, the drawing and the photo below, that you have created a lot more growth with this. There's also a chance that could potentially kill that tree in the future because there's just so much aggressive growth up top. It may not be able to focus its growth on a lower level and really provide you, much more of a better risk here. And usually sometimes that's encountering a disease problem. It also could be hard for the wounds to seal up because you now have all these open wounds for the tree based on this kind of topping. If it has been topped, what we really would recommend is that if you have the ability to come in here and try to find one direction for each of those substantial limbs to go. So you can kind of see that in both of these drawing and photo, because that has been topped, there now are basically three to four smaller limbs that are emerging from each cut. And so what realistically you could do is decide on the direction that limb is to go and eliminate, the others. So pick one from that single limb and then eliminate all the rest to kind of take over, if you will. Summer pruning is also not recommended. And the reason for this is that it's just very incompatible with the growth stages of fruit trees. They're really wanting to develop that fruit. They're really wanting to start to begin getting closer and entering into dormancy in the fall and winter. And so it's just a very incompatible time period for that tree to then focus on trying to seal up the wounds or for the growth hormone to then go to where that cut has been made. You might get away with very small limb removal. We usually don't recommend this. We really just don't recommend it at all. I encourage you to fight the urge to do any small limb removal, just because it's not really going to serve you much purpose. We certainly know that anytime you do pruning in the winter, you're going to have a lot of growth in the summer. Certainly get that, and yet it's just not incompatible. It's not compatible. The other thing is, do not do any pruning late summer into fall. So definitely avoid that period whatsoever of end of August into, say, November 1st. That's a period of time where the tree really needs to start to begin entering into that dormancy period in late November, December. And so this is a period of time where there shouldn't be any pruning done whatsoever. And yet again, I still encourage you not to do this. I still say try to do it and do it during the dormancy period. We'll see some examples of dwarf and semi-dwarf trees today, and yet I just want to spend a little time here that, it could be very similar approaches to regular sized trees. We think about, 30 to 40% of the tree limbs are coming off every season, if they need to come out, and it's very similar approach. The issue, though, is that a limb on a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree might be a pretty big percentage of that overall tree, if we're thinking of that tree being, say, 100%, if you will. The other benefit, though, is that especially for younger dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, you could address problems based on height and age pretty easily. We'll see examples of competing leaders going forward today, and especially on smaller trees, it's very easy to remove some of them even. You may also be able to weigh or kind of stretch the vertical limbs downward, which you see here in this drawing here. Ideally, we're trying to get what we call scaffold branches, the ones that are being pulled back with elastic, to stay as horizontal as possible, and yet they're very much prone to grow vertically. I think it's also important to think about cautious of, say, cutting too much from the tree in a given year. Certainly as I look at my dwarf peach trees that were planted this past spring, they may not need any pruning whatsoever this season. And it could just be that there's just not enough growth just yet. And really the focus for maybe into this upcoming growing season is to let them develop more growth in order to then be able to prune them in the years to come. That's certainly one strategy to kind of consider based on the age of a dwarf and a semi-dwarf tree. Whenever I've taught this class, it's very common that we encounter fruit tree problems. I think you are very aware that growing fruit in our planting zone has some good years and has some, not so good years. If you have encountered times where you've had no yields, it depends on kind of the type of fruit. For apples, you always need more than one variety, and you need them flowering at the same time. You may find that you've only planted Honeycrisp apples and they've never fruited for you, and yet the reason is that you need another variety in there. So they need to have proper cross-pollination. We also see a lot of damage in late spring frost, a lot of bud damage with these late spring frost into the 20s Fahrenheit that we encounter sometimes the end of April and into May. So it could be very much that depending on the growth of your tree and when it starts to flower, it could be resulting in bud damage. Peaches, plums, some of those other stone fruit, we typically see very cold winters that we see no fruit. As of today, we are probably going to, have some pretty good yields for peaches and plums. It really hasn't gotten cold enough to do damage on those buds. And the reason for that is that the buds of peaches and plums will be created the previous summer. And so then they have to overwinter and then they will blossom in the springtime. So they have to endure that hard winter compared to apples that doesn't happen. -8 degrees Fahrenheit is the cutoff for peaches and plums too. And certainly with some severe winters, we're getting into those temperatures. And as I say, every backyard can be a little different though. If you had no yield last year, but you had maybe a good year before, you may have gotten to biennial fruiting. And that's a issue in which there's too much fruit on the tree 1 year. And it's devoting so much energy that year that it really is not going to be able to fruit for you the upcoming year. A lot of times the way that this problem is addressed and resolved is to prune. And you may find that if you've encountered this situation, that you need to do a little bit more pruning than maybe you normally did. Sometimes, of course, cold spring, we have to just face that, that a cold spring into the 20s, depending on temperature, depending on where my fruit buds are in their growth stage, could determine whether I have fruit that year or not. If you have a lot of fruit drops, so say you have your flowers have survived the cold spring, they are producing fruit for you, and you come out one day and all the fruit has just dropped off the tree. There is a naturally occurring period where the fruit tree will do this in July. If you encountered that everything was pruned, there could be something else going on with that tree. The pruning should help alleviate some of this. It should help kind of reduce the fruit load on your tree to keep excessive fruit drop, but there can be other factors going on. And sometimes it is more environmental. Our pruning goals for fruit trees is to get the scaffold branches closer to harvest level. That's really what we're after. If you have a standard tree that's 25, 30 feet tall, you know that sometimes the fruit tree is just higher up. And at eye level, it's impossible perhaps for you to harvest that fruit. So ideally, we're really trying to think more critically on how we can get those scaffold branches that have the fruit closer to where we can harvest them. We also want to consider pruning out wood that interferes with trees' productivity. That's one thing that we're really after, is making sure the tree is staying healthy and it is healthy based on how I'm pruning it. We also might consider achieving a shape and a height that works for you. A lot of times when we're pruning some of my family's fruit trees, we're factoring in that we have to get a lawnmower through this orchard to cut the grass between the trees. And so that is factoring in when it comes to some of the limbs that we're leaving behind and some of the limbs that maybe we're factoring in that thing with it. We want to think about keeping disease from spreading. This is a time where fire blight, a heavily destructive disease, can easily be spread when we're doing any pruning with our fruit trees. And we also want to think about pruning with a long-term focus. I think that's one of the things that I really consider a lot, is that we want to think about how that tree is going to react when we prune, but we might also recognize that our plans for what we hope that tree's shape is going to be might be entirely different in year 2 or year 3, depending, of course, of how things go. So prune with a long-term focus, but maybe expect change and maybe expect the tree to be different. When I teach this pruning class, I tend to break our pruning goals up into 2 different categories. I have a category that I call high productivity. So this would be a lot of the dwarf, semi-dwarf trees that you might have in your backyard. This might also be a standard tree that's in pretty good shape that you're able to kind of remove some limbs with. And ideally, this is something where maybe in 3 years, you could be able to get your tree into some of the best shape of its life. Each year, you're aiming to do about 30 to 40% cuts. So you're aiming that when you look at that tree, you're only going to take about 30 to 40% off in that single pruning year. And for some trees, this might be a lot. For other trees, this may not be as much as you were really after or you're able to do. This is going to include kind of a big limb. It could include suckers, water sprouts, smaller limbs that maybe kind of get in the way of the tree's productivity. And as you look at like what cuts examples, imagine this like a mathematical equation. It's like, okay, you're trying to get to 30 to 40%. And so that means that a big limb plus suckers plus water sprouts plus perhaps smaller limbs and others is going to equal 30 to 40%. This doesn't involve topping, and of course, that should be eliminated because we would not recommend topping whatsoever. You also have a tree that's called a toleration. So it is a lot of times a standard tree. Maybe the tree is 35, 40 feet tall. It produces fruit for you. Some years are good, some years are bad. Perhaps it is a tree that, is a bit of a bad hair, up in the tree, the limbs are just all over the place. And yet you don't have the ability to get up higher up in the tree and prune that out. So this is more that you're just giving some attention to this tree. It could be you're removing water sprouts and suckers. You're potentially removing maybe those large limbs that are dead or really interfering with equipment, but you're not being expected to maybe get high up in the tree and do a lot of aggressive pruning because just based on your situation, you don't feel comfortable with that. And that's totally fine. When we look at homeowners and backyard growers and my family and our fruit trees, we have both of these. We have those that, yes, we can do high productivity. We can prune it, get it into really good shape. But we also have trees that are just toleration. They're just there because we like the fruits that it produces. I'm not going to be able to aggressively get in here and do lots of pruning. We're just going to classify it as toleration tree. So here's some of the standard equipment that we would recommend when it comes to thinking about pruning these fruit trees. And a lot of the equipment that you see here is pretty standard for most pruning. You see our hand pruners that work really well for some of the smaller limbs, some of those water sprouts, some of those suckers, some of the limbs that are just about a pencil width in size. Some of these, a hand saw is also one that you see here, that could cut in higher and up into the tree for certain limbs too. I think sometimes that is a really nice little device, or rather a saw that can work really well. You see a bandsaw here at the side, one that can get into some of those nooks and crannies that might be really impossible to get to. And then our final tool that I tend to recommend is getting some loppers. The loppers you see here are ones that are not going to be able to get maybe some of those really big limbs necessarily, but they're going to get some of the ones that are in between a saw and the hand pruner. One of the things that we would also recommend is getting some extendable. So you see with those loppers, I can actually extend them. And that's really important depending on the height of your tree. Some of the fruit trees we have in the Rockford office, the limbs are much higher up. And I found that having this extension with my loppers is really beneficial here. You may find that a chainsaw is also needed. I don't fully expect that you're going to have to do a lot of this, but you may find that a certain limb just needs a chainsaw. There are also these smaller chainsaws, which they call pruning chainsaws on the market. There's a couple of companies that manufacture them, and they look like they can work pretty well. I think the one concern with these smaller chainsaws, if you will, is that they can be pretty expensive. But there are a couple on the market you will see that are small that they classify as a chainsaw pruner, and they're electric. And they can work pretty well for some of those limbs. You'll note here that I've put a bottle of rubbing alcohol. And the reason for that is that when we think about pruning our orchard, we want to be really mindful of how I'm spreading disease, and we're going to try to prevent it. And the way to prevent this is to have a bucket of rubbing alcohol and dip your pruners and other things into it as you're pruning from that tree, especially before you move to the next tree. I recognize that this is asking a lot for you. I recognize this is also laborious task to do, and yet it is something to kind of consider, as you're making cuts on this tree to keep disease from spreading. It would be especially encouraged if you had any pear trees, because pears can be severely affected by fire blight, which can be spread during the pruning process and potentially kill your tree. So especially pears, try to do some type of kind of rubbing alcohol dip solution between cuts. During pruning, cut correctly during dormancy, we have this term called a branch collar, and you can see where my blue arrow is pointed. You will see, especially for bigger limbs, there's a bit of a bump there, and you're right in there going to cut. You're going to make sure that you're not cutting into that bit of a bump branch collar, but just before it is really what you're after. The reason for that is it will heal up much better by being right outside of that branch collar. So that wound that you're creating with this pruning will seal up much properly by being right outside that branch collar. As mentioned previously, try to clean tools often between cuts. Remove debris that could overwinter or has overwintered. This is a great time, if there's no snow coverage, to remove some of those leaves that have fallen underneath the tree. This is where destructive diseases like apple scab tend to overwinter. We previously talked about dormant spray. That would be where temperatures are into the mid 30s to up into the 40s. That's what you're after there. You usually will see dormant spray with other pruning. As mentioned, this is just an option for you. It's not that you have to use dormant spray, but it could just be something that addresses some of the smaller insects if you're concerned with it. For especially big cuts, you want to really consider, how you're making that cut. And ideally, because some of our big cuts of a fruit tree have the potential to do severe damage if they just kind of break off, you may find that you actually need to do a couple of small cuts on that big cut to kind of lessen the weight. And so you see what this means is that if you have a very big limb, you're coming up underneath it and you're making one cut. You're doing a second cut above it on the top part of it to kind of even out that weight distribution. And then you're making that final cut right up against that collar. So right where that collar kind of comes out and stops is what you're after. And this will hopefully be a strategy that if you had a very big limb, will keep it from causing damage with the cut and with the removal. You're trying to kind of even out that weight with it. For most branches, you're probably not going to have to do this, but especially for some of those bigger branches and bigger width branches, this would be a recommendation just because we really don't want to damage that tree. One of the other things to consider, if you have a very long branch, is where might you make that cut. So say that you like the branch shape, it's the right direction it's growing, and yet at the end of the branch, you find it's just starting to grow up vertically, which you don't want. You want it to stay as horizontal as possible. Realistically, the cut that you would be doing on that branch is that you are finding where the buds are of that fruit. And you see in this photo, this is apple. This is your apple and your pear. And so the smaller image is just of that one stem. And so that's going to be your leaf bud. And then the fruit bud is right here, what we call this little spur. And when you find this on the branch and say this is a branch you want to keep, you would go just about half an inch from it. And you want to kind of create kind of a slash. And you see that kind of cut is away from the tree, if you will. And the reason for that direction of that cut is that it will heal up much properly compared to if it was like a clean cut down it. You also note in the second drawing that I did for you that, as I was thinking, okay, I have this branch, I like the design of the branch, and yet it's going different directions. I don't like that it's doing that. Your cut could be right before it goes all three directions. And that may be some of what you kind of think about long term. It's like, all right, I've got my scaffolds in place, but as I follow the long horizontal branches out, they go three different directions, and neither three of those directions is the way I want it to go. So this season, I'm just going to cut it right there before it just starts to go out three different directions. So we'll talk about central leader first with apples and pears, and then we'll get into fruit bowl, vase, and that other shape. So ideally, we're looking for that Christmas tree shape. And as you think about this, consider, we have that one leader branch, and off of that leader branch, you have the scaffold branches, which are in the blue here. And these scaffold branches have the little spurs, which are going to produce the apple and pear fruit that we're after. Ideally, the bottom scaffold branch is going to always be your longest, and then you kind of make your way up to the top of the tree, and the scaffold branches get shorter and shorter. So you're really kind of after that Christmas tree shape. And the reason for that shape is to allow for good light distribution among those scaffold branches. That's really kind of what you're after here. You see suckers are in yellow, and the colors will show up again today. We'll get more into this as we go along. Water sprouts are red, they're purple, they're kind of all over the tree. Sometimes those are the ones that we see a lot of folks prune out a lot more. And unfortunately, they just keep producing and producing those. There's no secret to really keep them from showing up. That's just the nature of the fruit trees. Secondary scaffolds might be in the red. And so these could be ones that, over time could be a replacement scaffold if you needed. But as of right now, if it's just growing vertically, it's not serving me much purpose and I can remove it. Those branches are not producing fruit at this time either. We're also aiming for about 45 to 60 degree kind of crotch angles, which you see kind of in that black circle here. And the reason for that is by being kind of within that kind of degrees, it allows for a good balance that gets that central leader branch. Sometimes when your branch is less than that, so maybe it's kind of growing more vertically, that scaffold is, it's potential that over time, as that branch gets bigger and bigger, it could cut off of the tree. It could fall off, or it could just put too much weight on the central leader and break off. But by being about 45 to 60 degrees, this is really that can allow for some good weight distribution. So one of the first steps that I recommend when it comes to central leader pruning for apples and pears is to find the leader. Look for that leader. And you may find you have multiple leaders. You may find that you have one leader, but it goes off in different directions higher up in the tree. But starting to visualize where that leader is will then help you start to think more critically on how you're going to prune the tree for that season and for seasons to come. So once that's determined, start to look for dead wood, because dead wood can come out easily. It's wood that is getting in the way most of the time. It's not serving you much purpose. And it's really just being open to kind of any diseases and other issues. Look for water sprouts. Some smaller branches can easily come out during this time period. And you will find that may easily start to equal that 30 to 40% we're after. Consider looking for any crosses, any branches that are kind of crossing against one another. And then one of the other things I do is I try to look for replacements. So I might try to find a replacement branch within there that over time might become my replacement scaffolds. Or maybe I don't like that my central leader is going one direction, and I might try to find a central leader replacement. I'll explain this a little bit further, but that's one strategy that you might consider here. Consider finding your big cut. I think especially for standard trees, you will find that there are multiple big cuts. And yet if you were to take out every single big cut that season, it would just be too much for that tree to really withstand. So you may find that you are having to strategize with those 3 or 4 big cuts that you have in your tree. In this drawing from another extension service, you kind of see some very similar principles. So diseased branches, dead branches can easily come out off of that tree. Kind of where you see some of these kind of crossing branches and water shoots that are easily able to come out pretty quickly from the tree. Anything that's kind of broken branches, especially lots of suckers growing from the base of the trunk and the roots compared to water shoots that are growing from the actual scaffold branches higher up in the tree. But certainly, if we factor in, removal of suckers, removal of dead branches, diseased branches, and others, it can really start to give you a much greater overview and view of what your tree's next pruning needs are. And you can see this really that, before any kind of pruning, just focus on the unwanted growth. And then from there, factor in some of those other strategies that we've talked about today. So dead wood you see here on the left, it's going to be very noticeable. Sometimes when you kind of put your fingers into it, it actually starts to kind of break off some of that wood, depending on how severely it's been damaged. I think you'll find that every year you're going to find some dead wood on your fruit trees, and that can easily be some of the stuff that can come out quite well. Some branches are just all over the place. This is one of my fruit trees that our family has in Tennessee. And so you can see it's just like, oh, where do you begin? There's everything. There's crosses, there's branches growing vertically, there are branches growing into the tree, those going downward. So, it could be that you have a lot of this happening, and a lot of the maybe first couple of years of focusing on this is going to be removing those that are not doing you much good at all. And realistically, that's what you find is that it's a branch that's growing straight into the tree that's serving me no purpose. It's a branch that's growing downward or completely vertical. It's not doing me much good at that point. Lots of suckers are on this tree here to the left. This is a fruit tree. It looks pretty rough. It is one we've just kind of kept around, but you'll note that a lot of sucker removal from the base of the tree, and really it should have been done a couple more years beforehand for it to not be as bad looking as it looks at this age. Depending on your trees, you may have competing leaders. So this is one that you see here on the right. Both of these are basically the same width at this point. They are competing leaders. And yet because of the age of this tree and its height, it's one where I couldn't remove that leader. I really couldn't comfortably, at least what I feel, take out one of those leaders and now focus on the other leader to have scaffold branches off of. So, that's something that you may encounter based on the age of your tree, is that you can't remove a competing leader, or maybe you could. Maybe you have the potential to do that. Some additional things that you might encounter is bird damage. Sometimes a burlap wrap around certain areas, very loose fitting, can really help with this. Occasionally you'll see seasonal weather damage. I know we had a lot of calls at the University of Illinois Extension office this past fall and summer due to some of the storms that we encountered, where folks had some fruit tree damage, and some of it was pretty bad, where it was causing some really bad damage to the central leader. And they were kind of asking, well, what should I do in this case? And most of the time, try to support if possible. And that's what you see in this photo. One of our fruit trees had some weather damage and looks rough and has been using this support for probably close to 10 or 15 years at this point. So if it's a tree that you really like, if it's a tree that maybe has an emotional attachment you have to it, perhaps the support could work for it, but it may not fully recover from that initial damage. Any limb loss during the season, so say that you have a branch that has broken off and it has left behind it's not a clean cut, if you will. Try to do some remediation. That would be the only time that we would still recommend, try to remediate with a cut, and yet we still would not recommend doing a sealant. And hope for recovery. See how the tree bounces back. If it was a lot of limbs that were lost during that period, you may find that you do actually not want to do any pruning for this upcoming year, or reduce the amount of pruning that you might plan to do, just based on if there was a big limb that came off or something of that matter. This is also a time where you might have encountered deer or wildlife damage, or kind of noticed that. This, yet again, may lessen. You may not want to prune this season. This is a photo of one of my peach trees where I had deer damage the first week of October. So the deer had decided to get a head start in pruning for the season. And because it's a very small tree, because this is just its first year of growth, it was one where I certainly needed to remediate the damage that was done. But also I had to factor in that I'm probably not going to prune this fruit tree because it has already lost a limb, and because it's such a severe amount that's already been lost, if you will. We would still recommend any deer guard as well, kind of around the base, and kind of remove mulch around the base of the tree. One of our class participants today has a photo of a deer guard, and you can kind of see what that looks like. Soap deterrent could also be recommended. Irish Spring is what we might recommend. The smell tends to be something that deters them. There is also a hot pepper spray that's available where you could spray this onto the leaf tissue and the tree. The issue is that some of the hot pepper sprays on the market are not labeled for fruit and vegetable production. So find the ones that are labeled for that. Now, I don't expect you, of course, to be eating the leaves of your fruit trees, and yet you still want to ensure that it's something for fruits and vegetables. As you can also imagine with hot pepper spray, anytime that there's any kind of rainfall or whatsoever, that will tend to be washed off of that tree. So you may need to reapply it. If you have deep cuts into the leader, I'm always on the fence with this, as I still am not going to recommend necessarily removing that tree that season. I would give it some time to see how that tree bounces back, just to see if there is if there's a way for that tree to recover in some fashion. You've taken so much time and energy to plant these trees, and to now then be faced at potentially removing that tree based on a deep cut in the leader, I'm a bit hesitant to suggest that. Yes, of course, it's a tree by tree basis though. So what I do with a lot of fruit trees, and you saw this in one of the emails that went out, is that I take a lot of photos of the trees and then utilize Microsoft Paint, which you should have on your computer, or kind of any other program that might allow you to actually draw on the tree. I then utilize these ideas of leader branches, scaffolds, vertical limbs, and try to really think about, okay, what am I looking at here? And what I find by doing this process is that it starts to give me a game plan. It helps me figure out what I hope the tree could look like over time, and where are some of those branches that I really need to save and need to look for. And it allows me to not just be going out to kind of our orchard or the fruit trees and just start pruning away, but to actually have a visual plan as to, okay, this is the shape we're after. This is some things that might need to be addressed. So you can see in this drawing here that, I'm trying to find where a central leader might be. I'm looking to see what we might classify as a scaffold or lateral branch. Both of those terms mean the same. And then I'm looking for maybe those vertical branches that are red. And as you can imagine, a lot of the red will really be pruned out, but you can kind of see that I might find, okay, the central leader is not growing as straight up as I like it to be. I might have scaffold branches that are going more vertically, which I don't really want, but I could also find that I have replacement branches. Perhaps one of these red branches that I've colored here could replace one of the scaffolds higher up in the tree that I'm not after. So I recognize it's a 2D image, of course, and this doesn't classify everything that's happening behind that tree and fully around that tree. And yet I think this strategy I found can be really helpful when it comes to having a game plan in place. So we'll use a couple of examples and we'll show some class participants examples too. So you can see with this tree, we've got kind of a central leader idea in mind. As you work your way up with that central leader green, you do kind of note that you have almost a split. You almost have two central leaders on this apple tree. So potentially I could come in and I could remove, one of the directions that my central leader is growing in. You also can kind of see, especially on the right side, that my scaffold branch is, or rather one of my water sprouts or sucker rather, is kind of grown more vertically. While it could be a scaffold over time, it might be one that I decide to actually prune out. You kind of also can see some of the crosses that are happening in this tree as well with it. Certainly would classify as a toleration tree just based on the age of this tree. You can see how old a lot of these branches are as well. That kind of rough looking tree you saw a couple slides ago, you can see that certainly it's a lot of red. It's a lot of water sprouts and suckers that are going to be easily coming off of that tree. That would be the first steps and the first actions. There are some scaffolds here in place. Certainly this is kind of that semi-dwarf tree as well. So we do have some older blue scaffolds here that are, we hope, producing some of the fruit that we're really after. And you can see that we have a bit of a direction off a central leader in some capacity. We just kind of want to keep that kind of straight shape that we're after. I believe this is a Wolf River tree. It's a much older tree. And we've just kept it just due to a toleration at this point. More examples to come, but as you start to kind of color your trees and think about the shape that they need to be, consider those upper limbs. And that's really what you're going to find with standard trees, is that you're trying to replace those upper limbs. You're thinking about, okay, the fruit is really being produced higher up in that tree, 25 feet high up, and you can't reach it. So you want to think about where you're at eye level, and you want to see if there are any replacement branches that could be your scaffolds to produce fruit. So that's really what you're thinking of, is to try to find those replacement ones. Look for a competing leader. You may find that you have this, and depending on the age of the tree, you could be removing it. Certainly the photo you see here, I couldn't do that. At this point, we're talking about 50% of that tree if I was to take out one of those leaders. And because of the shape of the tree at this point, it would just be too severe for that tree to really recover from. Look for narrow crotch angles. That could be very easy to kind of angle for and kind of consider that, okay, it's too close to the tree, it's growing too close to that central leader, and I want to prune that out. Consider making your cuts and then kind of assess them in the summer and next winter. As much as it may, as much as we talk about fruit tree pruning, this is something where every year we're going to encourage you to keep pruning your fruit trees. It's not something that every 5 years you're going to be pruning. You're really talking about a long-term commitment here if you haven't figured that out yet. Or if you're determining whether or not you're going to prune your plant fruit trees this season, we're talking about a very long-term commitment with these. So the previous photo you see here, we've got 2 central leader branches. We've got our scaffolds in place in the blue. And ideally, I'm going to see if underneath that bottom row of blue scaffold branches, if there are any replacement branches, any of those very small water sprouts that are right off of the central leaders could potentially be a replacement branch. So that's where I'm after, because right now the fruit is so much higher up in the tree, and I want to see if underneath that low scaffold branches currently in place, there are potentially replacement scaffolds that I'm going to have to baby. So certainly it's going to take years to replace the scaffold branches higher up, and yet I want to see if I could find those and kind of encourage them over time. So growing season next, start to look for those replacements. I think that's what you're going to really find if you don't like the shape of your tree, is finding replacements, and look a lot after fruit fall, especially if you prune this season and then the tree will naturally drop some of the fruit this summertime. See what the impact of that tree is. See how the tree is performing, how it's changing. You're going to find that giving it some attention through this pruning process is going to potentially dramatically affect how this tree performs and the shape of this tree. But look for the effect of weight loss. Plan for that year or 2 of renovation. So have a longer game plan, and not just in 2021, but consider what 2022 is going to look like. So I'll use one of our trees as an example here. We have a tree, this is Virginia Beauty. It's a very old variety, heirloom variety from Virginia. And we pruned out a big branch a couple seasons ago. And realistically, there were 3 big cuts this tree needed. You can see the 2 behind it where we made this cut. The reason for removal is that these scaffold branches have put so much weight on the central leader that we're really concerned about them breaking off. So we've decided after a couple of years, every year we'll take out one. So you can see that when you start to prune, I have kind of an immediate response with some of these smaller branches, and I now have potentially replacement branches. One of the other things that occurred is that you can see that some are in good shape and could be a replacement branch, while other ones are just not ideal. That lower branch, very small branch at the bottom, that sucker there, water sprout rather, it's not going to serve you much good. I could easily prune that one out. But certainly, if you're removing a limb, you will find that the response of the tree could be to create some replacements that you really like. And we're still debating what we want to do here and what we want to consider when it comes to any kind of replacement branches. We've removed some of these smaller ones already, but certainly some of the other ones we might keep around just to kind of see, how that changes the tree. And so that's what I mean for kind of look this summer, is that you may find that there's no baby scaffolds that have shown up yet. And yet once you start pruning, the smaller scaffolds will start to show up as replacements this summer and for seasons to come. This is a dwarf tree that was pruned a couple of years ago. And you'll note, especially on the left side, that now I have a lot of replacement branches that have shown up. And so I can go through here and I can actually start to potentially get some scaffold replacements in here. You'll also note too that realistically, we might have about 2 competing leaders here. And I do have the potential to probably remove the one on the right. The only concern is that as you look at this dwarf tree, I don't feel like I could comfortably remove that entire competing leader in 1 year. I think that on that right competing leader in the green, I am probably going to have to maybe slowly cut it back. The reason for that is I just think it's too big of a percentage of that entire tree for me to remove that year. But certainly just by giving some attention to this dwarf tree, I have potential to replace some of the scaffold branches that you see there on the left and the bottom, and choose potentially one of them as a replacement scaffold over time with it. Probably one of the ones in the middle that has a good weight to it. You'll also note too that, because these smaller branches are pretty flexible, I could begin to train them a little bit more and kind of put some weight on the ends of them to make them stay a little bit more horizontal, if you will. But certainly as we think about our 30 to 40% cuts for a single season on a dwarf or semi-dwarf, we're not always talking about a lot. This is also a tree that was pruned pretty aggressively 1 year, and then you can see kind of the result was like, oh my gosh, we've got a lot of growth, and we fully expect that. That's something that you're just going to have there. It's what's going to occur when you start pruning this. Similar situations. So say you prune in 2020, and then you revisit that tree in 2021, you're going to still follow the same principles. You're going to look for dead wood. You're going to look for kind of any water sprouts, any suckers off of that tree. You are potentially going to be removing maybe 1 to 2 limbs again in shape, and you might be potentially finding that big cut. But I think what you're going to find is that while in 2020 you may not have a lot of replacement branches that you want for that tree, certainly when you start doing some pruning for the tree, the replacements are going to start showing up. Whether that's good or bad, I think is up to you and really depends on your fruit tree. So here are a couple of photos that some of our participants sent today. As I share with you, please feel free to send me some photos. I'd be more than happy to color these for you and send them back to you as well with some suggestions of what I think you might be able to kind of do on the trees themselves. I put this photo up here today and realized there was a deer in the background too. You can kind of see it there on the right. So this is Jeff's tree, and this is Jeff's pear tree. So yet again, we're thinking about maybe a central leader structure. It is a standard tree just based on its height. And I think one of the things that you kind of see is a really nice, solid central leader. That central leader branch is in a really good shape. And then higher up in the tree, it goes multiple directions. So from there, you could, if you felt comfortable, decide on the direction that you want that tree to go. I think on both the right and the left side, you might, though, start to look for replacement scaffolds. I think there's some potential there to replace some of those scaffolds higher up in the tree. And the reason for that is I think probably a lot of your fruit is being produced higher up. And so it's probably hard for you to get to. You'll also see kind of in the red here, especially on the right side, there's a lot of vertical limbs there that are colored in red that are really not serving you much purpose. Removing them is an easy pruning step that you can do because they're not doing you much good. They're just going to get bigger and bigger for years to come. And they're not a branch that we're really after. Higher up on both sides in the blue, you can kind of see where branches are crossing, or maybe they're starting to grow vertical, where certain pruning could occur. But for a standard tree of this height and size, you've got a good, strong central leader in place. And certainly you might look for opportunities around that tree for replacement scaffolds too. This is Mona's crabapple tree. So she sent this in, and you can see that it's pretty good as far as, looking kind of at the central leaders in shape. I think, at least kind of what I saw in this photo, it looks like you do have a bit of a split here with that green central leader. And there's an opportunity perhaps to maybe get it, more in one straight direction. You might be able to get away with it. And that's what I've tried to do kind of in that circle that you see here. Um, on both sides of the tree, you have a lot of scaffolds that are just kind of crossing each other. And I think that's where the opportunity is going to be, is to remove some of those branches where they just kind of where they're crossing one another, especially on the right and the left in the circles. You can see that they're kind of growing straight into the tree. At least one of them on the left is. You also note that some of the branches are just a little bit too busy. That's sometimes what we notice a lot with fruit trees, is that there's just a lot of branches going on. They're just a little bit too busy for you, and you might need to remove one of those scaffolds out. And that's what I've tried to highlight at the bottom with this final white circles. Is there's two scaffolds that are just rubbing up against that scaffold higher up in the tree, right above it, that you probably want to remove with it. This is Alicia's tree. Alicia is not able to join us today, but just wanted to go ahead and include her tree today. This is one where you've got a bit of a design central leader in there with the green. You do have some scaffolds that are maybe a little bit overpowering. I think you can especially see that on the left, where that scaffold branch is pretty dominant. One thing that I didn't mention today is that we always want the central leader to be the tallest limb on our tree. If I have a scaffold branch that is more dominant or much taller than that tree, that's really not what we're after, because we don't want it to overpower that tree. And so you can kind of see on Alicia's tree, especially on the left side, that there's one kind of dominant limb of a scaffold that's growing vertical. And I think she could potentially remove that limb over time, or at least start higher up and work her way back with it. You also note there's just a lot of those little red branches that could come out very quickly with hand pruners. And there's also opportunities on both the right and the left where I've made white marks that could be cleaned up a little bit more and provide a little bit more of a shape as to the dimensions that she's really after here with this tree. Overall, it's one where you kind of can see that, okay, I can prune out quite a bit and get to that 30 to 40% this year. Mark sent along a number of fruit trees, and I wanted to include one of them today. And I believe this is an apple tree, Mark. Please correct me if this is a different one. But I looked and I thought I saw some apple spurs on this tree. One of the things that's great about Mark's photos here too is you can see he's got a deer guard in place, which is also what we would recommend for very young trees. I have a deer guard in place. Clearly it didn't work well for me. You also note kind of around the tree is a weed-free area, which is also what we're after too, to keep some of those smaller animals from getting to the tree. Because of the age of Mark's tree, you see a good defined central leader there in the green, and then it's just trying to kind of clean up those blue scaffold branches. He's got quite a lot of them on the tree, and I think he has the potential to kind of get things back into more of that central leader shape he's after. But as you can also imagine, with this size tree, 30 to 40% this year is not necessarily going to be a lot. It may just be that you focus on one side of that tree and think more about how some of those scaffolds are competing against one another and kind of crossing each other with it too. It is a tree that's almost designed like an open fruit bowl shape, which you might be able to do, although typically we see more of a central leader with it. You can also see with this tree that there are scaffolds on both the right and the left that are potentially a little bit taller than our central leader. So you will want to be mindful of that too, of making them a little bit shorter and cutting them back. Our final tree is Fiona's. So this is one of Fiona's pear trees. So you can see with Fiona's tree that there's a very long branch. There's one in the red, and I highlighted that one because I think it's probably too, it needs to come out because it's too low on that tree. You can kind of see kind of that green central leader within that pear tree. You also kind of can see too, Fiona, that you've got kind of these little areas, and I highlighted them in black here, where the scaffold branches are just a bit too taller than that central leader. So you kind of want to make sure that that central leader is, as tall as it can be, and you want to kind of remove some of those scaffolds that are just a little bit too tall. But keep in mind, based on the age of your tree and based on that 30 to 40% idea, you may find that you can't take out all of this. It may just be a little bit of pruning them back, probably getting rid of that one red branch for the season is what I might suggest too. So thanks for those that sent them. Thanks for letting me use them in today's presentation. I'll send these back to you with some suggestions of what you might do for the trees. At the same time, for those joining us today and still want to send fruit tree photos to me, feel free to do so. I will try to send them back to you as well with suggestions. I'm more than happy to help you get started when it comes to it. So one of the questions we do get occasionally is the Espalier design. This is one that works really well for apples and pears, but it can take some time to get there. We really think of this as working really well for, say, you think about grapevines, or you think about that kind of scaffolding system with grapevines. This could work pretty well for you. Kind of the main issue, though, is that it does require some light pruning throughout the year. So while we still would recommend try to not do much pruning in the summertime, this is one where you may find that you have to do a little bit of light pruning. I kind of put together a little bit of a design here for you to kind of show you what this could look like, because maybe this is something that you might think of, for the years to come, or perhaps it's something you're looking at getting into. And you can see that, ideally that first year of planting, you're doing a bit of what we might consider a heading cut here. So about 2 feet from where that dwarf tree is, you're going to actually make a cut. And then that is going to be kind of your first branch. And then from there, your kind of blue scaffolds are going to develop, and you're going to basically bend them back, thinking more about that kind of grapevine design with it. In year 2, year 3, you can see I've kind of put some different circles around where I'm kind of holding it against the trellising system I have in place and the fruits producing off of that. And then finally, year 3 and year 4, really you're keeping those blue scaffolds in place. They're producing the fruit, but you're removing some of those smaller kind of red branches that you see here, the ones that really aren't serving you much purpose within it. And similar principles to what we've already talked about before, where it's a water sprout, it's a sucker, it's growing vertically, it's growing inward, it's not doing me much good here. But I think this could work quite a bit, this Espalier design, depending on your growing area. And we would still probably recommend a dwarf tree for this system, certainly not a standard tree. Perhaps you might be able to get away with a semi-standard tree, a semi-dwarf tree rather. So our last group here is the stone fruit group. So yet again, kind of peaches, plums, nectarines, all of them, they tend to do really well with the fruit bowl shape because this allows for better air circulation and allows for better pollination. That's really why we encourage a stone fruit kind of fruit bowl, kind of open center shape. You have a single trunk. It's about 18 to 30 degrees high, 30 inches high rather. And then you have scaffolds that come off from it. And they tend to be close together. They're growing vertically, and you have no branches facing southwest due to we're trying to reduce any kind of shade that might be on these branches. You have pretty crotch angles about 40 to 90 degrees. So we might recommend this shape if you had, a semi-dwarf tree of 3 to 5 years, if you just planted a tree this past year of 2020, or if you're planning to plant a fruit tree in 2021. A fruit bowl, kind of open bowl shape, could work pretty well with you. But we also see central leader with this design too. So you can see, as we think about, okay, my first year of spring, of planting it, I may come in, I might do a cut here, which you see in this drawing. And then from there, we're kind of creating kind of this open bowl shape with my scaffold branches. And then the scaffold branches are producing my fruit buds as well as my leaf buds here. By the third year, if I'm thinking I have planted that first year spring, and now I'm in my third year of spring, I would have a pretty good, nice kind of open fruit bowl design here, where we have multiple scaffolds growing off of it. The one thing to be cautious of is that, as some of us know with growing stone fruit, we have good years and we have very bad years. And I think this is one that if you are growing the fruits this far up north, don't be aggressive with pruning if you know it's going to be a good year. I think especially this year, we are potentially, at least at this point, expecting stone fruit. And you may decide that years that are a little more, that are more aggressive in their coldness to do the pruning, if you will. So be mindful of that, because I want you to have fruit this upcoming season, especially if the weather is going to be cooperating. In the photo you see here on the right, this is the peach bud. So this is the bud from one of my peach trees, and this is what you're looking for. So it's going to look very different than the actual pear or apple. You're going to see that kind of fruit bud shape within that black circle there, and that's what you're going to look for. So this is one of my peach trees. I believe this is Reliance, I think. So this was planted this past spring. This was not pruned by the deer this year. But you can see, you know, I've got my scaffolds in place. I've got a bit of a central leader design. And then, you know, higher up in that tree, it kind of branches out. And the reason that I probably see year one removing this branch and year two removing that branch is because it's not giving me that fruit bowl shape. You know, I really want to focus a little bit higher up in that tree. And I think because of that shape that has already been created in the growth this season, I'm probably going to remove one in this year and one in year two. I'm still thinking about it. I'm still kind of considering kind of what our weather looks like, because certainly we're only really talking about a tree that's entering its second year of growth this upcoming spring. And knowing full well that I'm hoping for maybe a couple of peaches, it may be more mindful to wait a little bit of time, as it still is not much of a problem at this stage. So potentially some of the pruning I might do is this smaller red limbs that are in the way. This is the other dwarf tree. So this was the one that was aggressively pruned by the deer already this season. You can see that just giving kind of that central leader shape, you can then see I've got my 3 scaffolds that are growing off the top. I have one smaller scaffold from there. Certainly, we're not going to be pruning this season on this tree. The deer have already pruned it. They pruned it in a shape that I think is going to work, at least this upcoming season. But you can find that maybe depending on the age of your tree, your stone fruit, it's in the shape that works or it's the shape that doesn't work to get to that open bowl, fruit bowl design. This is one of our peach trees at our Rockford office. We have 2 peach trees that are behind our Rockford office building. And as you can see, they really are a central leader style, if you will. Like, we don't expect that these trees are going to get into any kind of open bowl, fruit bowl shape, vase shape. That's just not going to happen. There's a lot of opportunities to prune. I think that's really what we've encountered, is that especially in the red, you see here, there's lots of branches growing downward that can be pruned out. There is a scaffold branch on the left that's just way too low on the ground. We need it to be much higher up on that tree, at least 4 feet high. And that scaffold branch is at about 2 feet from ground. So we don't want that tree. This is one that potentially I could take out a competing leader. You can see how that I have 4 leaders at this point. And because of the width, it is quite possible that I could remove one of these. You know, it's still playing around with what we're going to do here, because there's so many other things that need to be done on this fruit tree that I find. But certainly similar principles. It's probably going to stay a central leader its entire life. It produces really good fruit for us depending on the season. So we're getting wrapped up here today. I just want to mention a couple of things, a couple of like resources available to you. You know, if you're looking for particular apple varieties, Orange Pepin is a website that a lot of folks tend to recommend and like, especially looking for particular varieties. There's also the Midwest Fruit Explorers group. I believe you do have to have a membership to join this group. And yeah, it's a group that really encourages heirloom varieties and kind of focuses on, you know, taking some you know, pride in some of those unique Midwestern heirloom varieties of fruit trees. We still sometimes recommend Apples of North America, which is a book that can give you a greater understanding of some of those varieties out there. As tends to happen with this program, is some folks have a fruit tree on their property and they just don't know what that variety is. And it can be very hard for us to narrow down and give you the actual name of the apple that you might be growing. On our YouTube channel, we do have a program. We do have recordings of different pruning classes. One is through University of Illinois Extension's local foods team. There's a webinar from a couple years ago that's very similar to today's presentation. There is also a YouTube channel that our office has, and we have a backyard orchard that was presented this past spring. And that gives an overview of just getting started in backyard production and some of the issues that we run into when it comes to backyard orchard production too. There's a number of guides from Michigan State, Oregon, that get into kind of pruning the old and neglected apple trees. That tends to be an area that I focus on a lot of, as you've heard today. And I'll make sure to send the links to those guides if you'd like. And as far as the Espalier pruning, University of Florida has a wonderful resource on that. When we talk about pruning your trees, one of the things that I didn't get time to highlight is that there's numerous insect and disease problems. And so you may find that you need to address insects and diseases much sooner than later. And one of the resources for traps for certain insects in the orchard is Great Lakes IPM. And that's where you can order traps for certain insects that might be potentially causing you harm in the orchard this upcoming season. So as we get wrapped up today, really think about determining the shape. Maybe you're going to find that, what I've told you when it comes to central leader works really well for your trees. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're able to get the tree into a shape of the open vase or that Christmas central leader shape, or maybe you're not able to. That's really fine. We'd love for you to get that shape, but you may find that you're unable to get it, and that's okay. One of the main steps to consider is finding that leader. Once you figure out where that leader is, it can really transform what sometimes is a very intimidating process of starting to prune, especially pruning trees that maybe have not been pruned for years. I certainly know that's the case when it comes to a lot of my family's fruit trees in Tennessee. There are trees that have not gotten enough attention and need that attention. Look for your scaffolds, look for where that fruit is going to be, look for those little spurs for the apples and the pears, look for on your stone fruit where that fruit bud is. Find the big cut, look for a big cut on your tree and think of that's going to be the big cut in 2021. Yes, there are many fruit trees that I see where there are big cuts for years and years, and yet finding that big cut can be the one step that really helps you out. And it can also just change the way that fruit tree looks, and the tree will certainly react very differently. Look and expect a long-term practice, get into this habit that, okay, it's mid-December into March 1st, I've got to go out and prune my fruit trees during this time period. And consider that a great practice that gets you out of the house and pruning your trees. One thing to also share is, make your cuts, but don't stress about the wrong cut. It's still a fruit tree at the end of the day. We still think you're going to have a fruit tree, that even if you have potentially made the wrong cut, or maybe the tree didn't react in the way you wanted it to, it's still a fruit tree. It's still, we hope, going to work out really well for you. So you've got my email address there. My phone number is listed there as well. You can directly reach me. I'll send a link as well for our YouTube channel that has some of our recordings. You will also get today's recording next week that will also be accessed through our YouTube channel. And at this time, more than happy to answer some of those questions that you might have still. I'm going to turn my video on so you can see it. All right. Please advise. Okay, there was a question about please advise on ways to trim the scaffolds. All right. So one of the things to consider, yet again, kind of with the scaffold branches, and I've got my marker here, is that, if I have a scaffold branch and the scaffold branch is in really good shape against that central leader, I want to keep this scaffold branch. Realistically, what I'm doing here is I'm just going to find that scaffold branch and I'm going to decide if this is the shape I want or if it's the shape I don't want. You can see kind of within this drawing that I've got the scaffold going downward, which I don't want, so that would be pruned out. I've got a branch up here that's going that way, which I don't want. One going vertically, which I don't want. So realistically, I like the scaffold shape, it's just going to go straight outwards. So that might be what you find is that, when you look at a scaffold branch, you may find that the scaffold branch is growing straight up, and that's not what you want. You would just find the scaffold branch, and then right where it starts to grow vertically is where that cut may need to be made. Now, the problem you might encounter is that once this cut is made, of course, it's going to produce a lot more little water sprouts. So now potentially you've got to decide a direction in year 2, or you actually have to remove them again and see what happens. So that's ideally what you're thinking of here for that scaffold branch. There was a question about what about the relation between fruit thinning and pruning. So with this, ideally, if you are doing any pruning, it's going to help address the thinning. Hopefully it could lessen the need to do any thinning if you're pruning it out. There is also sometimes a mathematical idea of, okay, as I think about these multiple scaffold branches and I think about all the fruit that's going to be produced off of the scaffold branches, I might come in and kind of balance out the fruit. So I might find that I have a scaffold branch, yet again, that has, you know, lots of spurs of fruit. And so potentially during the pruning period, I might be able to prune out the shape of some of the scaffold and reduce that fruit. But then I might also even look and see that I have a lot of fruit and perhaps I prune some of that out too, you know, with hand clippers perhaps. Ideally, as we think about scaffold branches, we're looking at maybe 3 to 4 on either side to kind of balance that tree. You could also do some additional thinning in the spring, kind of by shaking the tree. There's also chemical thinning that could be done, but it sometimes has detrimental effects on your bee population. I think my first suggestion when it comes to any kind of thinning is to focus on pruning, see how things are modified or changed that upcoming season, as to if that maybe addresses that thinning that might need to be done. And the way that I would find that maybe I need to potentially have thin is that I have a lot of fruit drop in July, kind of that natural fruit drop that I expect. There was a question about how close together do the different varieties of apples need to be. Ideally, it's a 50-foot radius is what you're after here. So wherever those varieties of apples are, they need to have a 50-foot radius from each other. You could do a crab apple as your pollinator though. So, you know, if you had a crab apple that's already established, most of the time those are good matches for your fruit trees. And yet again, they need to be 50-foot radius with it. There was a question about, for central leader design, how far apart of the trunk should scaffold branches be for dwarf and semi-dwarf trees? So for this one, you know, for standard, we sometimes see a standard tree would be 1 to 2 feet typically between. I would probably say for dwarf, you're looking at maybe 8 to 10 inches between those scaffolds. One other thing to mention with those scaffold branches of say 8 to 10 inches is that the scaffolds should not be on top of one another. So if I have a scaffold branch here and I have, let's say I have a scaffold branch here and I have a scaffold branch here, they should not be, I should not have this top one blocking out the light from this bottom one. I should have them kind of perpendicular, if you will. They should never be parallel. Your scaffold branches shouldn't be. Any additional questions? Those are the questions I've seen so far. Oh, let's see, make sure I got that. As long as I see it, okay. All right, well, if no more other questions, thanks for joining